Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and today's video is going to have spoilers from the most recent episodes of Andor Season 2. When I first saw Syril Karn in Chief Hind's office in the first episode of Andor, I took an immediate liking to the character. Here was an earnest young man eager to do his duty and willing to sacrifice personal time to solve the murder of a colleague. When I look at a show like Andor, I try to analyze characters and understand how they see themselves, right? I don't look at the larger picture of, oh, he's serving this evil empire, because the honest truth is, most bad guys, most villains don't actually think they're evil, right? They think they're justified in their own actions. And so the awkward quirks, the nervousness, the small modifications he does to his uniform, it all completes this image of an inexperienced security officer who is passionate about his job. Of course, other people might view him as a rent-a-cop or an eager little fascist who likes oppressing the average person in the galaxy, someone who really needs to be dealt with in the most hostile way. But I believe Syril Karn is actually quite a special character, an important character for the franchise, especially for the times we're living in today. When George Lucas came up with the original Star Wars film, he was reading The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, a treatise on the countless myths that have inspired humanity and how they all share inherently the same structure and similar themes. You know, Lucas was an anthropologist before he was a film student, and he always believed that these shared stories, these myths we pass from one generation to another, were key in those societies' survival. It creates cultural resilience. And that's because a lot of these myths impart great wisdom and positive values into the population. Take a look at his original story with Luke Skywalker leaving the moisture farm and venturing out to the galaxy. This was supposed to be a modern myth, a guide to all young children growing up in the 1970s. This is a period of great social upheaval. You had the liberation of many minority groups. You had liberation of women in certain aspects of their lives. And so this leads to a change in society, a change in traditional family roles and the role of men and women. And despite the fact that most of these changes were very positive, whenever there is change, certain people get left behind. Oftentimes we're talking about the most vulnerable individuals in society. A lot of times it's just children. The message that Lucas crafted for them was clearly laid out. Be like Luke Skywalker, the all-American looking California kid. Find power in hope, resist cynicism, believe in friends, not institutions, and most importantly, trust your internal moral compass more than anything else. Politics, hokey religions, and terrible dads, well, that can wait until you have more experience. The fact that Star Wars got so famous, most likely because of its neat special effects, allowed those messages to inspire a generation of kids who hopefully, when they become adults, become better citizens, who have a better understanding of what the dark sides in life actually are. We skip forward to today, or a few years ago when they started creating Andor, a series that Tony Gilroy has called the most important work he's ever done. And I agree with that assessment, because finally we have a Star Wars show that is not only entertaining, but a show that imparts great values and wisdom to the viewers. In many ways, Andor is carrying the torch that the original Star Wars film lit almost half a century ago by becoming a true modern mythology. Andor, more than any other show, is interested in the truth. Yeah, that's basically what it is. Tony Gilroy is doing an exercise where he takes a bunch of very different people and he places them in this very hectic situation, this galaxy on the edge of open rebellion. Tony Gilroy isn't really trying to convince us of one thing or another overtly. He's showing us a mirror of how human beings react in these kind of situations. And I think Syril Karn is probably one of the most important lessons we can learn from. It's so fitting that the last word Syril Karn hears before he dies comes from Cassian Andor.
Who are you?
Syril Karn has chased this man for years. He's been obsessing over his capture. In many ways, Cassian was like his Moby Dick. Yet despite thinking about Cassian for so long, it never really occurred to him that this enemy he's built up in his head doesn't even know who he is. It shows you just how absurd this whole situation is. Also, the question, who are you, is a literal question to Syril. Like, what do you stand for? You know, this is something that Syril Karn has spent his entire life trying to figure out, but he ultimately fails miserably to do. Syril Karn is not the hero. He's not an anti-hero either. He's not even a traditional antagonist, although it seems like in the very beginning, Syril is the foil, the counter to the show's main hero, Cassian. Whereas Cassian seems to always be in the right place at the right time, like he's driven by the Force or some other providence, Syril is always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even when things look like they're trending upwards for Syril, he's only getting fattened up before the slaughter. When I was a young kid, Cassian Andor's poster would have been on everyone's wall, back when we all went to movie theaters still and saw the same movies. But take a closer look at Cassian, and he's actually relatively bland. Diego Luna's performance is great, but as a character, he lacks outward emotion. He's brooding, he's always fatigued and traumatized, and I think this is purposely done. He has a character arc for sure. His actions move towards rebellion, but there's actually very little change to his core personality. As a matter of fact, the more we learn about his story, the more we realize that this isn't a story about Andor joining the rebellion. It's about him returning home to the rebellion. He's always been here. Andor has been chased by oppression constantly throughout his life. There's really no escaping it. And every time he tries to escape, like after the Eldani heist, he ends up spawning magically in an Imperial Supermax labor prison. It's almost poetic that Andor has no choice, that he's constantly being dragged kicking and screaming towards the finale, which is Rogue One, where he dies. Syril is the exact opposite. He's an unknown entity. He wasn't orphaned as a child. He didn't witness his adopted father get gunned down by the Empire or hung by the Empire. He wasn't pushed into having a purpose or an identity. Instead, he grew up in a pretty mundane and bland existence. I think it's something that we can all relate to a certain degree, right? And most of us are not born into revolutions. And I think, Cyril's family dynamics were pretty messed up. His father left his mother at a pretty young age, and I think his mother suffered a lot of mental health issues as a result of this abandonment. It also probably wasn't very easy to survive on Coruscant, especially when you have to raise a boy yourself and work. And once the Empire took over and started creating this crazy wartime economy, well, things got even more difficult for people like Edie Karn. The result is Edie Karn becomes an extremely overbearing individual who seeks constant emotional control over her son by making her love conditional and using whatever little affection or just peace she can grant her son as a reward for him meeting her perfectionist standards. And an adult can leave that situation, but a child becomes trapped. And that can be very bad during their early stages of development if they're constantly being assaulted by people who he's honestly supposed to trust. If you can't trust your mother, who are you going to trust? It's no wonder Syril is unable to express himself properly. It's no surprise that Syril seems to lack confidence. A child like this who has never experienced unconditional love will develop an unhealthy need for external validation, and they will never feel secure in their adult lives because of this unmet requirement. And because of this, Syril struggles to figure out who he is as a person, and I don't think it's his fault at all. We all have an identity. It just takes a lot of time for us to figure it out. A lot of times we have a really poor idea of who we are. Our perception of ourselves is very skewed by a lot of things, like our emotions, our ego, and our poor memories. This all creates a great deal of bias and false information. Oftentimes what we see ourselves as is an idealized version of who we want to be rather than the true thing. Syril, as a member of the Pre-Admiral Line security team, for instance, viewed himself as a crime solver, as a defender of justice. The reality was he was just a kid, an inexperienced officer in a corporate security outfit that was really not interested in justice or keeping the peace. They just wanted to continue to provide minimal services and cut their costs. It also didn't help that his mother was constantly breaking him down for taking this job and pointing out that he was incapable to be in law enforcement. Our identities are mostly shaped by the relationships we have, both positive and negative. There's supposed to be this entire support system that starts with your family and your friends and then extends out to your teachers, your coaches, guidance counselors, your therapists, and all of this is designed to nurture a child and protect their sense of self, allow them to slowly figure out themselves who they are. It is extremely important that all children get this type of positive reinforcement at a young age because our core values are formed during these times, and these are the most concrete parts of our identity. Then there are also identities that society pushes onto us, like gender roles. If you're a man, you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to look strong, be muscular, like all these tactical blueberries that Syril is working alongside. That is actually a subculture, and in that subculture, you have to be tough, you have to be aggressive, because this is a dangerous job where people are risking their lives. You also shouldn't be showing your emotions and your feelings, which makes sense in the middle of like an operation, but is in the long run not very healthy. Then there are the experiences we go through as we try on different hats and identities. Syril goes through quite the roller coaster of an experience during the show, doing exactly this. It's incredibly important for young boys to start figuring out their identities at a young age. And that's because our identities give us a foundation. It guards us from outside influence and helps build up a person's confidence, so that when we set out in life, we have a clear understanding of who we are, where we stand in the world, and what kind of decisions we should be making. On this channel, we talk about approaching things with an open mind, adopting beliefs, slowly, and being careful and listening to other points of views. Some people might view this as a philosophy that is lacking a foundation and lacks core beliefs. But the truth is, only when you're completely sure of who you are and what your identity is can you be so open-minded and confident in yourself that you open yourself to all different ideas in the pursuit of truly understanding yourself, because that is the goal. But our brains, our ego, it creates fear, it creates rejection of new ideas, it resists change because that is the body's defense mechanisms. And the truth is, for a lot of people, finding any identity, even one that doesn't fit their personality and core values, can be quite difficult. And so when they secure that identity, they hold on to it for dear life, because that's all they have. I remember growing up, playing sports was my entire life. Like, that's all I talked about, that's all I thought about. And, obviously, as I got older, I realized it was dumb. I had other interests. Even back then, I had other interests. I liked video games, I liked literature, I liked movies. And as I got older, I developed a general sense of just being interested in how things work. I became interested in politics and economics. And yeah, in hindsight, I look back at my high school and middle school years, and I wonder, would my life be better today if I had spent more time with other groups of people, not just all the jocks and athletes? I think I would have really enjoyed hanging out with, people playing Dungeons and Dragons, the LARPers, the film kids, all the other various groups that I kind of ignored because being an athlete was so core to my identity. And again, this identity wasn't something I was created, by my natural love of sports. Nowadays, I don't even watch football anymore, which I used to watch. I don't watch any sports really anymore. I could hardly care about what's happening. And I think the reason is because when I was younger, I was pressured into playing sports. As a young Asian American, I experienced a lot of racism. It's different from what other groups go through. We kind of are just seen as aliens. We look physically different. The food we eat, it's very different. And I remember encountering a lot of problems, a lot of stereotypes that Chinese boys especially were weak, weren't good athletes. And of course, me naturally being the hard-headed person wanting to prove everyone wrong. So I became exactly what these people said I couldn't be. But at what cost? I don't know. I think I adopted an identity that just wasn't mine. Now, luckily, throughout this entire period, throughout my entire life, I've adopted many different identities. I've joined many different groups out of curiosity, but my core foundation has never been shaken, and that's due to my parents. My parents never really had a lot of time to spend with me because they're constantly working, but they did impart a lot of important lessons to me through conversation or through, taking me to see films like Life is Beautiful at 10. It's a very tragic Holocaust film that I don't know if a 10-year-old should be watching, but these are the things they did for me. They made sure that I had values, I had a moral foundation, and everything else in my life has really been guided by that kind of moral compass. It's allowed me to stay away from radical, extreme movements, like political movements. I've also, worked alongside religious organizations that are very extreme. For some reason, in my life, I've always had to encounter groups like this, but I've never joined even one, and I thank my parents because of this. I think in today's world, it's becoming more and more rare for young kids to have this experience. The traditional family and community structure continues to break down because of society's advances, but also the advances in technology and the way we communicate. Syril Karn is very much the poster child of what happens when a young boy doesn't have a positive role model or support at home. Instead of having a father or a mother who can teach him important values like honesty and compassion. We have Syril's mom, again, constantly trying to find a way to break him down and destroy his confidence. It's actually extremely sinister. I'm actually surprised that Syril didn't turn out to be a complete monster. So what happened? Well, I think Syril naturally has a very strong personality. And so that void inside of him created by his mother's abuse forced him to reach out and grab hold of whatever identity was next to him, anything that could ground his sense of self. At the time of his childhood, the galaxy was in, great conflict and chaos. This was because of the Clone Wars. Syril would have been bombarded by pictures and videos of brave clones fighting against waves and waves of separatist droids. He would have probably eaten up all of the Republic propaganda that rightfully painted these clones as very heroic and courageous individuals. And so young Syril, like many kids his age, played with clone trooper action figures. I know I did. The clones represented everything Syril was not. They were strong, they were decisive in their actions, and most importantly, they mattered and were respected. Syril completely bought into the Republic propaganda. He yearned for purpose, glory, and brotherhood that all young men seek when they go to war. And this actually saves him to a certain extent. It gives him kind of a moral foundation that just wasn't there before. And that alone is a victory in my books. It's a starting point that allows Syril to get out from beneath his mother and try to make something out of himself. Yes, he takes a job in the peripherals of the galaxy for a corrupt security organization, but we all have to start out somewhere. And what is more heroic, right? Like a charismatic, very athletic individual struggling to become a star athlete, or Syril Karn just not giving up all hope, surviving his wretched childhood and not offing himself, or just staying at home forever with his mother because he's completely broken. Syril's victories might pale in comparison to the star athlete, but his struggles are far more difficult to overcome. And so I do think that Cyril's struggle is very heroic in his own way. We all have our own struggles in life that we go through. And, comparing one person's struggle to another oftentimes is just not the right thing to do. Now, Palpatine did something very devious when he took over the Empire and destroyed the Republic. You see, he tried to make the transition between the Republic and the Empire extremely smooth so that no one noticed the difference between these two very different government organizations. And one of the most important things that Palpatine did was he tried to roll over the Republic's military accomplishments into the Empire's. That's because many people, including impressionable youths like Syril, held the Republic military in high esteem. The clones were courageous, they were completely selfless during the Clone Wars, and because of their sacrifice, order and justice was brought back to parts of the galaxy that had been overrun by the Confederacy. It makes sense why kids would look up to the clone troopers. Look at what they did during the Clone Wars. Their sacrifice was epic. They saved the entire galaxy without asking for anything in return. The only problem is, Palpatine doesn't care for the well-being of the clones. They are stuck in that conflict in the first place because of that crazy war he orchestrated. Plus, when the war was over, most of these clones were replaced because they're too expensive to maintain or, represented a security risk against Emperor Palpatine's rule. Of course, Syril, all those kids who grew up worshiping the clones never got that memo. And so when they saw the stormtroopers, they just immediately associated that white armor with the clone troopers. And so I don't think people understood the difference. And soon the victories won by the clone troopers were perverted into a narrative that supported the Empire's authoritarian message. Authoritarianism can be extremely appealing to certain types of personalities, especially people like myself who are really impatient and impulsive. Like I get into fights with my wife all the time when we're trying to plan logistics for going out during the day. As I've gotten older, I've realized that there's definitely some issues with how impulsive I am, and these are things I'm working on. But yeah, authoritarianism really does appeal to people with this type of personality. Instead of having multiple institutions working together and debating which path forward is the best, you have a strong figure who can make all the decisions for everyone and simplify everything. This appeals to people who might not understand how the Senate or judicial system works. These are very confusing institutions and they oftentimes talk in political speech, so you never understand what they're saying. But a populist authoritarian who can cut through all that bullshit, all the negotiating, all the Senate subcommittees, well, that's appealing. Just one individual solving all of your problems, that is something that is much easier to understand. Of course, we know in real life and in Star Wars, when one person tries to rule the entire nation, galaxy by themselves through just executive orders, it's a disaster because one person is just not capable of doing all those things. You are simply limited by your lack of cooperation with other people, with other institutions that are really just designed to aid the executive in the decision-making process. It's an entire system. It's always been. Under a strongman authoritarian, not only do you not have to think as a voter, they're also going to identify you as a supporter as one of the good ones, and anyone who doesn't support them as one of the bad ones. So there you have it, the black and white way of framing things also is how you attack your political enemies and anyone who can potentially threaten your rule. And this, again, makes everything very simple for your supporters. You don't have to think, you just act. These are the bad guys, go get them. It's kind of like the military in some ways. Now, Syril Karn thinks he fits well into this new political order. After all, he is disciplined and thorough at his job. He's extremely dedicated to fighting crime to the point where he's almost zealous in his righteousness. He is really a perfect recruit for such regimes and organization. The thing that makes Syril so interesting is despite all the horrific things that he goes through, he actually is a pretty trusting individual and perhaps more open-minded than your typical fascist recruit. If you take a look at how he interacts with the Gorman Front, for instance, there's an understanding and empathy for their situation. Syril is rare in that he truly believes in law and order and justice, right? It's not just him saying stuff and trying to use his position to, give himself more power or to silence his enemies. This dude is oriented to law and justice. That's what he is. I mean, if you think about it, Syril was right to pursue Cassian Andor after he murdered those two Preox Morlana guards. This was his job, and to let things go would create more chaos in society. Of course, Syril didn't know that those two guards instigated the situation. How could he? In a lot of ways, being sent to the Bureau of Standards further protected Syril from realizing what the Empire was actually about. And when Syril finally figures out what's going on Gorman, we see him lose control for the first time. This is a man who should be emotionally imbalanced because of how his mother has treated him all these years. He clearly has confidence issues and sometimes doesn't regulate his emotions well. For instance, he oftentimes lets his excitement show. It's not only weird, but also kind of cute, I guess. I don't know. But we've never seen him physically violent until he realizes what Dedra Meero has done. Syril actually almost kills Dedra with his bare hands. It's a shocking display of aggression, a quick turnaround that shows us what happens when our entire belief system is brought down in a split second. It also shows us where Syril actually stands. He hates evil. He hates injustice, the harming of innocent people. That's what makes him different from Dedra. That's what makes him incompatible with her. I mean, even when he has that very violent fistfight with Andor, he still legitimately thinks that Andor is a terrorist. Like, he hasn't fully realized that it's not just Dedra that is the problem, it's the entire Empire. And the rebellion might actually be right. I think in previous Star Wars entries, Syril Karn would have defected like Iden Versio or Agent Callus. But I think Tony Gilroy wanted to make a point, you reap what you sow. Or more importantly, maybe Gilroy is just trying to show one of the more cruel aspects of authoritarian governments. They target young, impressionable men, radicalize them, convince them that they are superheroes who are destined to fight the monsters of the Empire, and then they just discard them when they're no longer needed. Like those poor Imperial Army troopers that were sent into the center of the Gorman Plaza in order to start this entire massacre. I know Syril is ultimately kind of an unsympathetic character. It might remind you of some assholes you've dealt with in the comment section, or maybe just some, fascist bootlicker or authoritarian bootlicker that you've met in real life. But remember, most of the people who hold these extreme views are vulnerable and weak-minded. Many are just trying to find a place to fit in and lack a true moral foundation because they have been neglected their entire lives. It sucks that they have chosen a life that is consumed with hatred and anger, and that they've become so close-minded to what truth actually is, but by fighting these people who are oftentimes very isolated and paranoid, I actually think it does the opposite. It doesn't break apart these groups, it makes them much stronger. I often am inspired by individuals like Daryl Davis, a black man who has spent his entire life talking to and befriending Klan members and de-radicalizing them. Many of these Klan members were even heads of chapters. Daryl Davis has done far more good work through empathy than any corporation that pretends to be woke, or even the legions of people who go out and counter protests and punch Nazis in the face. Daryl Davis has probably de-radicalized thousands of KKK members, and he did it all through empathy and understanding. In most of these organizations, there are only a few very dangerous individuals. Most of the rank and file, again, are neglected youths who come from poor backgrounds, who don't have education, who don't have jobs. They're being exploited oftentimes by members in their own groups for fees or to sell drugs to cover those fees. It's not an easy life to be a fucking skinhead. First of all, I'm Chinese, so I obviously don't support their crazy ass ideology, but understand that these people are in these places because they're vulnerable. Whenever we create vulnerabilities in society because we don't take care of a certain portion of our population, those people become extremely susceptible to radicalization and extremism. It would have been nice if Syril had been given a chance to kind of see where he'd gone wrong, an opportunity to understand and be forgiven for his actions. I think he actually would have made a really good rebel. His views on justice, his empathy for others and their well-being. We chose to ignore all these signs just because Syril chose to walking away, talking away, and belong to a certain type of organization. I think Syril is a great character because it reminds us that even in the heart of the enemy faction, in the heart of an authoritarian regime, you have countless amounts of people like this who are just caught in a system that they don't necessarily understand or even belong to. And that oftentimes confronting these types of people with violence is not the answer. What we really need to do is try to reach out to them, to talk to them, and kind of de-radicalize them, because there's a lot of things that these kind of people can offer to the world, to the galaxy. Just because they've suffered a lot as children and went astray doesn't mean they can't have a redemption arc of some kind. Obviously not in Andor, but, in real life maybe, right? Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.